Hello and welcome. I'm Maria Ressa and this is Talk Thursday. Joining us now is Nicole Curato. She's the Assistant Professor of Sociology from the University of the Philippines. Before becoming a teacher, she was a postdoctoral research fellow at the Center for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance at the Australian National University. She's also the convener of UP's Election Watch. She's with us today to discuss the social and political trends in these elections, the 2013 elections. Nicole, it's good to have you back on Rappler.
Good to see you again, Maria.
So today is the count. Have you seen all the things that have been going on with it? What do you think about Comelec's move, the move to try to stop the reporting of Transparency Server?
Yes, that's actually one of the most interesting things, especially when we started automating the elections. One of the challenges in terms of automation is how to explain to the public what the glitches are, where we're having difficulties with, because it's such an esoteric, complicated function, right? And this is one of the things I think we need to have a conversation about, because we tend to assume that when it's automated, it's necessarily good.
Yes.
Whereas there are a lot of other countries that have gone back to manual, primarily for these reasons.
Yes.
That we need to have our votes counted publicly. So I think for me, that's also a standout issue for these elections. What kind of beast are we confronting with an automated election?
Why have other countries moved away from the automated counting, automated voting and counting?
Yeah, I think one of the examples we can think about is the United States when the Gore
In Florida.
Yeah.
Yes.
Of course, they were talking about dimple chads at that time, but it really exposes the complexity of different voting systems and the challenges of eventually having to move back to a manual count, because ultimately it's still the most credible, most transparent form of counting votes. I think that's one of the reasons. And then the other reason really is to restore the public's trust as far as vote canvassing is concerned. We cannot fully rely on a technology that people cannot fully understand. One of the things that sociologists often say is that technological development is always an uneven process. We leave our democracy at the hands of the experts who have a very difficult time explaining to us what's going on. And I don't think that's necessarily good for democracy, especially since we're in the process of hiring who governs us.
Yes. The impact today of some of the announcements today seem to have shaken some of the trust that was inherently in there. Did you notice that? Do you agree with it? Do you not?
I just think that the issues surrounding trust in relation to elections are just changed, because before we did have trust issues when it comes to elections, but it was a more crude form of cheating that we were facing at that time. We were talking about dagdag bawas, electoral violence,
Yes.
harassing teachers, but now it's a different story that we're seeing, although it's the same, it falls in the same storyline of trust, right?
Yes.
Except that now we don't precisely know what we're confronting, whereas before we know exactly that we're confronting coercion, violence, electoral fraud.
Gauging the way the 2013 elections have panned out, you've been watching it closely and
Yes.
talking about it. How would you describe it now?
Yes, I would tend to stick to my initial impression that it's very much a mixed picture. On the other hand, on one hand, we see a lot of developments in terms of awareness for a lot of voters. Information or access to information now has become great, especially for the tech-savvy youth.
Yes.
I also think that a lot of democratic space has been created in terms of campaigns against EPAL politicians, against trapos and dynasties. But on the other hand, it's still very frustrating, because the main or the heart of elections is choosing who governs us. And the minute the certificates of candidacies were filed, we already had an idea that this election is not really the most genuine election we can have as far as choices are concerned. So it's really a mixture of both creativity among citizens and the limitations on that creativity precisely because of these structural barriers imposed on us.
It's so interesting you're talking about the way technology can affect it, but at the same time, what underlying values do you see motivate the Filipino voters, at least in the way they voted in these elections?
Right. There have been a lot of studies on what kind of candidates Filipinos prefer, and I think the studies here as early as the 1960s have been consistent in saying that Filipinos are looking for a candidate that is approachable, right? A candidate that they feel that they can relate to, someone who can reach out to them. That's not necessarily the same value sets that we see in other countries where, for example, they look for an intelligent candidate. In some countries, they look for a technocrat, for example. But here it's very different because of that personalistic element, and as I think it's also reflected with the results of the polls now. It's not really just a simple issue of people in patronage and their political patrons. It's also an issue of people assessing the candidates based on that value set of whether can I trust this person? Does this person reflect who I am and the value system that I have?
But it's also interesting when you look at the names of the top 12 that are there. It seems like they wanted the certainty of the past, the names, the last names that are the same, but yet they wanted change, so they had a new generation of the past. I guess, how would you characterize, again, this, we seem to be in great flux right now with a new president, a high growth rate, and technology, and yet we're still so solidly anchored in the social networks of the past. How would you characterize the choices that were made in the 2013?
Yes, I think, again, those choices are contingent on the premise that these are the only people we can choose from. For sure, we have a lot of independent candidates. We have a lot of new names. We have 33 candidates in this election, and a lot of those 33 names are new names. But the underlying question is, how come these people didn't get a fair shot at winning this election? And primarily, the reason for that is because it's so difficult to mount a formidable campaign if you don't have a political last name, if you don't have the political machinery and the dynasty to back you up. So overall, I think in a way we can say that the Filipinos have been shortchanged as far as choices are concerned, because our choices have been limited the minute COCs were filed.
I'm just going to, you said earlier that people want someone approachable. I remember reading these things that said that up to 80% of how we choose, we make any decision is based on how we feel.
Right.
Do you think that, and I guess that what could pull that down is awareness, information, self-awareness.
Right.
Are we moving forward? Do you see a movement forward?
Yeah, I don't mind that people decide based on emotions. I guess as far as you're buying a pair of shoes or you're buying shampoo or trying out a new product. But as far as politics are concerned, I think these emotions have to be tempered by rational thinking, although we have to be very careful what we mean by rational thinking. I've always held the position that we have to be very understanding on the different sets of rationality that people have when it comes to voting. I think.
What do you mean by that?
Yeah, because we've seen a lot of heated exchanges in social media, right? And I think if we have a mood meter in that social media, a lot of these memes are just angry.
Yes.
A lot of these, basically, status messages and tweets are very angry, directed at particular candidates. But then this is where political maturity comes in, because these are the same, my assumption is, these are the same people in social media who claim to be politically informed. That's why they feel they have a right to criticize the massa for not voting correctly or for this candidate to run without any qualifications. But again, we have to push that emotion a bit further, because that's what distinguishes us human beings from animals, right? We're able to process our knee-jerk reactions and emotions based on particular stimuli. So I think just going back to the social media component of it, I would very much love to see a social media that is more reflective, that is more conversational with the discourses that are not present in that platform.
More civilized.
Yes, or sometimes, you know, some people would say civilized discourse is such a bourgeois value. Sometimes we need the critical bite, the sharpness. Sometimes it has to be vile in order for us to, you know, to directly confront issues that we have to confront. But sometimes being confrontational also has to be tempered by reflection. It also has to be tempered by being other-regarding and reaching out to those who are unlike-minded.
Social media seems to be changing those values. I mean, there was the stereotype of a Filipino who's not confrontational, who is
docile.
Yes, and that's certainly not what we're seeing on social media now. Is the internet changing Filipino values?
Yes, that would make a really excellent study, because a lot of textbooks right now still categorize that Filipino as being conservative, family-oriented, but we see in social media a lot of changes in terms of these values. So I'm sorry I can't give you a definitive answer because that study has still to be done, but based on my impressions, it does feel like that. And a colleague pointed out to me, because I was making this earlier argument about engagement and not being confrontational, but my colleague also pointed out something really interesting, that yes, the Filipinos have been really quiet for a long time, and through social media, they are able to confront these dynasties. They are able to shame them.
Yes.
And shaming is an important process, or important component in a democratic process as well, because that's where we express our moral disapproval on particular actions. So yeah, in a way, we can bring these two values together. But again, I would hold the position that shaming does not end in shaming. In order for it to be a productive currency in a democracy, that shaming has to be followed up by accountability and conversation.
These elections, what role did social media play? It couldn't get a candidate elected.
Right, it didn't. No, you're right. There have been a lot of social media experts that said that there's no social media vote in the Philippines. Although I think the role it played, for me, my impression is, it really highlighted that divide, the technological divide between people that have access to social media and the kinds of discourses that are present there, and those that don't have access to the social media. In one of your previous speeches, I've heard that you already cited the theory of polarization, right?
Yes,
that people tend to get polarized when they have their own little
chambers.
spaces.
Yes.
And when they just engage with like-minded people, it creates barriers for them to engage with unlike-minded people. I think that's one of the features in these elections, rather than trying to ask questions, for example, of why would the massa prefer this candidate. They just end up putting down, or a lot of people end up putting down Filipinos and say, that meme, anyare, what happened, Philippines?
Yes.
It presupposes a superiority of a particular value set, without necessarily trying to open up that conversation of, let's try to think about this some more. What message does this send to us who don't relate to other people's values?
Or what are the implicit assumptions in the questions you ask? You have several questions now coming in, so let me throw some at you from Ria M. Bergoño. Is educating the not so well informed Filipino electorate on voting for the right public servants really hopeless?
We have to unpack that further, because voting correctly, what really does that mean? If you say, I look at the track record and I look at the educational background, does that necessarily mean voting correctly?
Yes.
We were having a conversation about this a couple of days ago. Like, if I'm from a poor family and I demand that social services are given to me, and that only happens during elections, and I vote for that candidate, is that an uninformed vote? I think given that context, it is an informed vote.
Yes.
I would tend to find fault among middle-class voters who have access to all information but end up voting for the candidate just because they know that person, right? So I would tend to be more, I would tend to reflect more on that question, on what do we mean by smart voting.
Old campaign tactics still work. They seem to have carried the day. The name recall, vote buying, although no one will admit that they did buy the votes. Do you see these old tactics changing anytime soon?
I think so, because we can notice, like, one of the biggest changes I think now is the postering, right? That used to be a big thing.
That was the main thing
That was
before,
the main
right?
thing before. Like, plastered Metro Manila with all of these ugly, ugly posters. And now we've seen a COMELEC that is very firm in saying that's not going to happen. So a lot of politicians are pushed to think of alternative avenues to do campaigning. I think one campaign strategist also said the sample ballots are also not that effective anymore. And the main medium to campaign is air war, bombard people with advertisements.
Media,
Yeah, so I think a lot of campaigning now has become really scientific, has become really professionalized. I think that's the word you've been using. And it's a smarter way of running a campaign, given that the resources are limited. To that extent, I think it's smart. But in terms of the integrity and the ethics of all of these campaign strategies, we have to, of course, have a different conversation about that.
This is an interesting question from Gerald Santos. In social media, is there such a thing as a social strata? as well? Is it based on income or education? If we're to base the election results on what we read in social networking sites, Nancy Binay shouldn't have won, yet it's a far cry from what the ballot boxes showed.
That's a very interesting question. I learned from another colleague that yes, there is a hierarchy in social media. You can see the difference between what they call the Twitterati, like the trendsetters in Twitter, versus the Jejemons online. And there is that seeming moral or ethical disapproval against the Jejemons, right? So it's another way of making that hierarchy. But I think the even bigger hierarchy, like what I said a while ago, was the exclusion of people who are not part of social media. And that has to be addressed. And like what I've said, technological development is always an uneven process. So in a way, we're kind of reinforcing that existing hierarchy we have between people who have access to technology and those that do not have it.
How does the 2013, how did these elections set up 2016?
Yes. You know, that's very difficult to answer because for social scientists, we can only make predictions with the assumption that all things held constant. But we know that in Philippine politics, there's no predictability and it's hard to make sense of what's going to happen in 2016. So we can just base our assertions on, okay, what do we know now? We know that Vice President Binay wants to be president. We know Junjun Binay's term in Makati is ending. So definitely there will be a different political move there. So what else do we know? We know that there are still a lot of dynasties that are incumbents right now. And we know from the literature that incumbents tend to win re-election because they have a more consolidated economic and political base.
They have a power base.
They have a power base. So predictions for 2016, all things held constant, probably it's more of the same. Because we don't see any large shifts right now in terms of the broader societal structure. But given that, it also gives us citizens a bigger challenge. Democracy is a creative activity. Democracy is not a spectator sport. It's a consistent negotiation of people and their government, right? So my impression is, given that our state has become so weak and corrupted by the elites, then the change has to come from below. It has to come from the citizens because the elites won't change the existing power structure anyway.
Which is why I'm optimistic about social media, because hopefully it comes up from below, but it still, how do you bridge the digital divide?
Yes, that's a very good point because it's unfortunate that some people are still in that framework that being in the internet is just a luxury. We have to provide books first, classrooms first. I think that's a wrong binary. It has to be tackled together because if not, we're just reinforcing that existing hierarchy that some kids are just better off with these basic services and not thinking of the internet as a basic service just pushes us back a lot more. So I think I'm not really that aware now of what DepEd's plans are in terms of bridging the digital divide, but I would like to see DepEd, especially with the K-12 program, being more proactive and considering being online as part of a basic necessity for a student.
My producer saying Twitterati versus Jejemon. Let me just ask you about that one. What does that show in terms of from a sociologist's perspective?
Yes, because there is that impression, although, and which is quite valid to a certain extent, that being online democratizes information. It democratizes democratic processes, right? Because as long as you have access to the internet, you can put your voice out,
you're
you
more
can
empowered.
be heard, you're more empowered, exactly. But the other side of that is, well, not all voices are equal. Some voices are still more privileged than others. And we see somehow in the social media existing social hierarchies of what's privileged and what's not privileged being reinforced in social media, right? So the common the common disapproval, for example, with the Masa crowd, with the Bakya crowd, with the Baduy crowd, it's really just reinforced online, right? Of course, there are also, I can't think of a specific example now, but there are also some parodies coming from some other players in social media making parodies of the extremely rich people, right? There was that hashtag saucy problems, for example. So it's a parody of the rich as well. But in any case, the binary still exists, right? The privileged and those who are not as privileged. And it's unfortunate that the social media hasn't become yet that avenue to blur that distinction and probably come up with other binaries like, I don't know, ideology, for example. Ideologies are usually things that bring people together regardless of their socioeconomic background.
we don't have political party systems that have actually put forward firm ideology so far, though.
Right.
Hopefully it'll come up. Let me throw a question for you from Carl Angeles. What do you think is or are the most influential factors in this election?
Right. It's very pessimistic to think this way, but I think it's very valid that it's still financing of campaigns, right? We haven't talked much about campaign finance reform, I think, in this election season.
Yes.
But it still is the main barrier for candidates to have a decent campaign. So I think that is the main structural impediment for this election. Not all qualified candidates, willing and qualified candidates, can have a fair shot at winning, not even just a national post, even local positions. It's very hard for them to run and provide a credible alternative, primarily because it can't be done. And that is unfortunate, because if we think about this in political theory terms, that is the promise of democracy. People have willingly given that social contract to the leaders because there is that promise someday of economic equality and redistribution of resources. We don't see that happening. This democracy has served to reinforce bases of traditional elites.
Oh, interesting. I'm interested in this because we just spoke with Bam Aquino, a campaign donor in the United States versus a campaign donor in the Philippines. There are different expectations based on culture. When you are donating money to a campaign here in the Philippines, what are your expectations? If you're a businessman, or are there built-in strings attached for our politicians that others in the West wouldn't have?
Right. I think we can learn a lot from the model of some NGOs in the Philippines. Some of them cap the donations from corporate donors, for example, to the extent that they will never be held hostage by just one campaign donor.
Yeah.
So if this campaign donor in the Philippine context, for example, expects you to vote this way on a particular bill that affects their industry,
Correct.
then you have the power or the capacity to say, no, I will vote based on what the data says, for example. Primarily because I don't care that much if I lose this donor, because that's just 1% of my total campaign finance, right?
Yes.
So that is why it's important to diversify sources of campaign contributions and not be totally indebted with one economic kingmaker.
But in a culture where we still have feudal roots, how do you introduce an issue like campaign reform, which is in between feudalistic, patronage-driven? How would you look at that? Sorry, I'm fascinated by that because we had just spoken about it the last hour.
Yeah, I mean, the good thing is there is this bill now in the Senate on campaign finance and political party reform. So that's a push towards that direction. Of course, we have to be very sensitive whether the new batch of politicians would welcome that kind of reform, which is also, I think, quite, it's a missed opportunity for us in this election, because once we started highlighting on political dynasties, for example, the response now of the candidates is, yes, I would like to file an anti-political dynasty bill. But since the pressure wasn't as big in terms of campaign financing, it's hard to hold them to account right now that, wait a minute, you promised for this during the campaign. What are you doing about it now? But I guess it's not too late. I hope the media can bring in more attention to campaign finance and how it's important and how public pressure should be present there, because I think that's the only way a dynastic Senate and a dynastic Congress can pass such legislation.
And I may be cynical, but how much of that is rhetoric and how much of it is going to be action? It's been there for a long time, hasn't it?
That bill.
Yes.
Yeah, even the bill on dynasties, we did a research on this in UP. Senator Juan Flavier, right? So circa 1990s.
The 90s,
filed a bill against political dynasties. I think it wasn't even heard at the committee level. So yes, it could be rhetorical at this point, but the thing is, it is an issue. It has become a campaign issue. And to the point that a lot of the media practitioners and ordinary citizens have been considering this as an issue that politicians have to address for this Congress. So I guess that's what I'm saying, that if it comes from the bottom up, if it comes from public pressure to put this on the legislative agenda, something can happen. But if we don't put it on the agenda, then it will be pure rhetoric. Nothing will ever happen.
This kind of civic responsibility, or the idea of that as a civic duty, is relatively new. Do you agree with that, or is it something that's been there?
Yeah, that's a good point. It's hard to assess because, they always say that the Philippines is the NGO capital of the world. We have the highest density of NGOs, people's organization in the world. I think we're only third or second to Brazil, which is a much bigger country.
Yes, correct.
So there's a lot of intense democratic activity that's going on from below. The question for a lot of social scientists is that how do you consolidate that energy? Because so far that energy is described as a democratic impulse, and that impulse has to be sustained even further. So I think that well, we've seen a lot of coalition building happening. For example, in this administration, we see participatory budgeting, bottom-up budgeting. That is fairly new, and that is there's huge participation by civil society groups. So these are good openings, I think. The idea is not entirely new, but the consolidation probably is a relatively new phenomenon, primarily also because the information is so easily accessible. It's so easy to coordinate.
We're actually trying to use the internet. We've started something called Budget Watch. We're trying to use crowdsourcing to help push something like that. Again, fingers crossed for the experiment. I want to go back to something you said about campaign financing and the reforms that are there. We talked about the politicians and their funders, but what about again, Bam Aquino mentioned that it's the steep price of the ads. He basically said 1 minute costs 1 million pesos.
Right.
Should it be socialized? Certainly you would have the media networks say no to that because they wouldn't kill a cash cow at this point. But is that something that government should be stepping in, or should we be involved in that?
Oh, I don't know, because now it's a broader question of what is the government's role in terms of setting the price in a supposedly free market for corporate media, right?
Or access to people, right? Because some of the Fair Elections Act was based on trying to maintain a level playing field,
right?
And now that's a steep price to pay.
Yes, exactly. I think that's probably one of the structural weaknesses of having corporate media, because it's all profit driven, right? But I guess again, it's good if the state does something about it, but I guess this is a private sector issue that has to be tackled with the private sector themselves in coordination with candidates too. I don't think, off the bat, I think it's not something that has to be explicitly legislated.
Yes.
It is, I think, local media's democratic commitment to uphold that Fair Election Act. So yeah, I think I will leave it at that. But it's definitely something to think about.
We are running out of time. I just want to ask you to look back now on the 2013 elections. What kind of, I guess, how have these elections changed or defined democracy in the Philippines today?
Yes, I think one of the greatest things about elections in the Philippines is that it puts our democracy under a microscope, right? It brings into sharper focus the kinds of democratic activities that have happened in the past 3 years that we haven't really noticed. So it is in these elections that we see a lot of watchdogs emerging that have been there, except that now they're getting attention because their roles have become bigger. It's also during election time that we see the worst of our politics, when we see electoral violence and vote buying and the lack of choices. But it's always been there in between election seasons. So I think, yeah, on the whole, I think this election is still a mixed picture. It's not an entirely depressing picture because of the spaces that I've talked about a while ago. There is still room for optimism, I think, but I would definitely underscore the fact that democracy does not end in elections. It has to be an everyday activity. It's a creative activity that citizens must engage in every day. We don't become political analysts and political activists once every 3 years. It has to be a democratic activity every day.
Hopefully it's something we can push. Well, a last question from social media. This is from @Jeff Crisostomo. He said it's worth mentioning there's evidence of change. We have Kakabagao and Lenny Robredo. Yes. Are the victories of progressive candidates in local races enough to initiate change at this point?
He's my friend, so hi, Jeff. That's a very good point, because the Ecleos are really formidable, like a big political family in the Nagat Islands. And of course, Lenny Robredo just also won by a landslide, if I'm not mistaken. But the thing with these success stories, unfortunately, is the sustainability issue. We've seen Among Ed lose in this election as well. But I think what's good about what Jeff pointed out was that we can learn from these success stories. And I think the main lesson from these success stories is that this is not a simple case of one excellent leader making it to the top spot or to that position. It's a case of that leader that is supported by a mass base of committed citizens. So we see that in Naga with that huge following and huge support system that Jessie Robredo had. We see that with Kakabagao also in her long history of political activism. So I think it's not a case of just finding the right leaders. It's the case of trying to create new crops of leaders that can sustain progressive change.
Wonderful. Any last thoughts? before we close?
Oh, I think we're all tired
We
of
are.
the election. So, yeah, I mean, I would just like to reiterate what I said, that democracy is not a spectator sport. It is an everyday activity, and we can't just suddenly complain every 3 years. Something has to happen in between.
Wonderful. Okay, thank you so
you
much.
also.
We've been speaking with Nicole Curata. She's the Assistant Professor of Sociology from the University of the Philippines. This is Talk Thursday. I'm Maria Ressa. Thank you for joining us. We went all over the world yet again.